In June of 1816, the rain would not stop falling over Lake Geneva in Switzerland, and the growing storms and general gloom had led 5 English travelers who were summering in the area to spend most of their days inside the Villa Diodati, which was a large sprawling mansion. And this mansion had been rented by a man named Lord Byron. Lord Byron was an English aristocrat who is already as famous for being a pioneer in Romantic poetry as he was for the many public scandals that had recently sent him into permanent exile. And while in Switzerland, Byron spent a lot of his time with fellow Romantic poet Percy Bysshe Shelley and Percy's 18-year-old partner, Mary Godwin. They were renting a house nearby, and Percy and Mary were fleeing a scandal of their own because Percy was still married to another woman. At the same time, Mary's stepsister, Claire Claremont, was pregnant with Byron's baby, and Claire had arranged this trip for Percy and Mary and gone on the journey with them. And so the 4 of them were stuck inside most of the time. Well, the 5th member of the party was a 20-year-old man named Dr. John Polidori. And unlike the rest of the group, Polidori didn't have money, a famous name, or a title, and he wasn't friends with the group. Polidori was in Switzerland to work because Lord Byron had been dealing with what a lot of people called melancholia and physical frailty following a tabloid-worthy divorce and public accusations of incest that suggested Byron had been having an ongoing affair with his half-sister. So by the time Byron left England, going into exile, he was kind of a mess. And he hired Dr. John Polidori as his personal physician to monitor his health. But whether Byron knew it or not, Polidori didn't really want to be a doctor. He wanted to be a writer. In fact, he'd even taken £500 from Byron's publisher to keep a journal chronicling the poet's time in exile. Now, thrown together in close quarters with members of the highly educated literati, Polidori believed he was in the perfect position to make his writing dreams come true. And on one rainy night in June of 1816, the opportunity to launch his literary career finally presented itself. After spending the day talking about the nature of man and reading German ghost stories translated into French, as the group was wont to do, Lord Byron had what is now a very famous idea. He said that all of them should write a ghost story. Percy Bysshe Shelley, never a fan of prose, started writing a poem. Lord Byron scribbled out the beginning of a ghost story that he would quickly abandon, and Mary Godwin, soon to be Mary Shelley, started writing what would become one of the most important and influential novels in Western literature, Frankenstein. Not wanting to feel left out, Polidori decided to write a horror story of his own. And years later, in a preface to Frankenstein that chronicled her time in Switzerland, Mary Shelley would refer to Polidori's story as, quote, a terrible idea about a skull-headed lady. And so poor Polidori, as Mary called him, would not achieve his literary masterpiece in Switzerland like he hoped. But he would latch on to a piece of Byron's discarded ghost story. And from Byron's germ of an idea, Polidori would write an entirely new story of his own. A story that would reshape horror and popular culture forever as it introduced much of the English-speaking world to vampires. But Polidori's role in vampire lore would all but be erased. And just a few years after that fateful summer in Switzerland, Polidori would lose his mind and his life. All right, let's dig a little deeper into the tragic life of Dr. John Polidori on Adjunct Horror. Not long after the now legendary ghost story night, Lord Byron unceremoniously fired Polidori as his personal physician and sent him on his way. Not wanting to return home being perceived as a failure, Polidori kept trekking around Europe and writing for a few months, until eventually he left the continent, went home, and then took a job as a doctor in East England. But even once after he was working as a doctor again, Polidori kept writing, and eventually he finished a story he called The Vampyre. The vampire focuses on a smooth and handsome nobleman named Lord Ruthven, who happens to be a vampire. He seduces and murders and drains the life of all of those who wander into his orbit. This is how Polidori describes Ruthven in the opening of his Gothic tale. A nobleman more remarkable for his singularities than his rank. He gazed upon the mirth around him as if he could not participate therein. Apparently, the light laughter of the fair only attracted his attention that he might, by a look, quell it and throw fear into those breasts where thoughtlessness reigned. Okay, so it didn't take much work for people who knew Polidori to realize that his handsome but dastardly Lord Ruthven shared several traits with Polidori's former employer, Lord Byron. And just as a side note, many scholars have suggested that Byron also served as a template for Mary Shelley's Victor Frankenstein, a man who has a huge ego and a pretty solid God complex. Now, at the time Polidori was writing, there was no record of any published vampire fiction having been written in English. But the word vampire had been in use in English for almost a century. That word derived from words used in some Slavic countries that they passed on when they were relaying the supposedly true stories of their vampire epidemics back in the 1700s. And the concept of supernatural beings that share certain traits with what we would call vampires today had already existed for thousands of years. Stories of blood-drinking demons can be found in myths and folklore in Mesopotamian cultures dating at least as far back as 3000 BCE, so over 5,000 years ago. While not the typical undead we're used to seeing in modern vampire stories, these ancient creatures, like the Ekamu, were often vengeful spirits who drain the life force of human beings. And even all the way back then, early on, a lot of these creatures were already being used to undercut past ideas of female divinity and to literally, or at least mythologically, demonize women. This can especially be seen in stories of the Lilitu, who were Sumerian female wind spirits who would feast on the blood of infants and other vulnerable people, or who would torment young men with uncontrolled sexuality. And these particular stories of the Lilitu would give rise to the myth of Lilith. And Lilith would make her way from Mesopotamian tales into various ancient Hebrew texts. And the name Lilith is often translated to something like night creature, night monster, night hag, or screech owl. And Lilith quickly became associated with all of the terrors and sexual abandon that emerged in the darkness of night. But in a much later piece of medieval Jewish folklore that would help cement a particular version of Lilith, she is said to have been the first wife of Adam, predating Eve. And after refusing to submit to her husband Adam, Lilith is cast out and transformed into a succubus who is cursed to wander the night for eternity, draining men of their blood and life force and giving birth to demons. And so it's these types of ancient and medieval vampiric myths and legends that slowly evolve and eventually make their way to Eastern Europe. And then they inspire Slavic vampire folklore and the subsequent real-life fear of vampires that would develop throughout Europe, the UK, Ireland, and later the United States. And so these myths and legends and then these real vampire stories are what Dr. John Polidori uses as his basis for the vampire. But instead of attacking female power or sexuality like a lot of the old myths, Polidori targets the aristocracy, a group of wealthy men and women who he believes feed on the lower classes. So, back in 1817, when Polidori had returned to England and started working as a doctor, he actually started doing quite well for himself. He had friends, he went out on the town, and he was generally perceived as a serious and good doctor. He even wrote medical essays. But despite that, Polidori had never stopped writing fiction, and he'd never given up his dream of literary fame. And then in 1819, just about 3 years after his summer in Switzerland, he thought his dream had finally come true because the Vampyre first appeared in print and it started to sell and gain popularity all across Europe and the United States. But there was a huge catch. The publisher had not credited Polidori as the author of The Vampyre. He'd credited Lord Byron. And so this led to a public, often comical PR battle in which Polidori and Byron, for very different reasons, vehemently argued against Byron's authorship of The Vampyre. Lord Byron, who'd heard about the publication of the story from a friend, wanted nothing to do with what he believed was basically terrible writing, while Polidori wanted credit for The Vampyre because he clearly believed it was his first of many literary hits. And so Polidori made his case through letters to the growing press in Europe and the United States. And he claimed that The Vampyre had somehow been taken from him, delivered to the publisher, and published without his knowledge or consent. And he told a story of how he had written The Vampyre at the request of this woman who he said was basically in love with him. And the more he told this story and the more details he added, the stranger everything seemed. And years later, when scholars started to really get into Polidori's timeline of events, none of it made sense. And so they came up with a new theory. Polidori and the publisher had been in cahoots because they knew that slapping Lord Byron's name on The Vampyre would guarantee almost immediate success and sales. But if that was the case, if that's really what happened, it totally backfired. Because even after Polidori got the writing credit he deserved, in a lot of people's minds, The Vampyre still belonged to Lord Byron, this man who Polidori had supposedly set out to skewer in his work. And whether it was because of this PR mess or because Byron's name eventually got taken off the text, sales of The Vampyre didn't last. And so Polidori never gained the fame or fortune that he believed he deserved from writing this popular story. And as time went on, and Polidori kept working as a doctor, this really started to eat away at him. And by 1821, so just 2 years after the publication of The Vampyre, Polidori started facing real demons that were far more frightening than anything he'd written about in his story. Back in 1817, not long after Polidori had returned from the continent and started working as a doctor again in England, and 2 years before The Vampyre first got published, Polidori's small horse-drawn carriage had slammed into a tree at high speed. And in that accident, Polidori was thrown from the carriage and suffered a severe head wound. Things were so bad that people quickly moved him to a manor nearby and summoned a Catholic priest to give Polidori his last rites. But Polidori survived, and after weeks of bed rest and months of care, he returned to health. At least in part, because after that accident, Polidori would often report that he heard voices in his dreams, and these voices were telling him what to write. And sometimes he would ramble on about these voices so much in public that the people around him said he appeared deranged. And Polidori's perceived derangement, and what was most likely his very real depression, only got worse after The Vampyre was published, because his subsequent writing was not well received, and his one noted work was still often wrongly attributed to Lord Byron by the public. And to cope with what he believed was his failure to achieve literary success, Polidori started going on these manic gambling binges, and he rapidly squandered his money and racked up massive debts to the point of financial ruin. So while he could have made a good living as a doctor, he found himself broke and destitute with no choice but to move back in with his father at his family's London home. And from there, things only got worse. On the night of August 24th, 1821, just 2 years after the first publication of The Vampyre, Polidori dined with some friends. But his thoughts and speech were so erratic that night that had alarmed the others at the table. And after his meal, it's believed Polidori stayed out late doing some gambling, either on credit or with family money, before returning to his father's house. Once there, believing everyone was asleep, he made his way into a secluded room. He found a bottle of prussic acid, also known as cyanide, and drank it. Polidori fell to the floor, writhing in pain as members of his family rushed into the room. But they were too late, and there was nothing they could do. John Polidori had taken his own life at the age of 25. John Polidori never achieved the true literary success he'd longed for while he was alive, and he remained in relative obscurity after he died, especially when compared to some of the other people he'd spent time with in Switzerland: Lord Byron, Percy Bysshe Shelley, and of course, Mary Shelley. But in 1872, over 50 years after The Vampyre had been published, Irish author Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu published an extremely popular vampire novella called Carmilla. Then, in 1897, heavily inspired by Carmilla, another Irish author, Bram Stoker, published Dracula, and vampires would soon become some of the most well-known literary figures around the globe. But decades before either of those stories were written, Polidori had laid the groundwork for the English-speaking world to invite vampires into their homes, as it were, and make them a cornerstone of horror in literature and popular culture. Polidori's The Vampyre introduced the idea of the wealthy aristocratic undead, the often charming, attractive, blood-sucking predator who's able to seduce his prey. And this is a trope that's still heavily used in a lot of contemporary vampire tales, and that has caused many modern scholars to go back and call Polidori's short story a foundational work of vampire fiction. Cultural historian, author, and renowned horror expert Sir Christopher Frayling once said, "The Vampyre is the first story to successfully fuse the disparate elements of vampirism into a coherent literary genre." So, when we praise Bram Stoker, Anne Rice, and the countless other authors and artists who've contributed to the cultural rise of the vampire, maybe it's worth taking a minute to remember John Polidori. And maybe we can give him just a bit of the credit he so badly wanted when he was alive. All right, y'all, thanks for tuning in to Adjunct Horror. Make sure you check us out every week for new videos on horror in history, literature, and the arts. And like, subscribe, and all that stuff. And I hope to see you soon. Bye, y'all.